So today we are getting into the first Chimurenga, but we are going to look into the causes of first Chimurenga, both in Mashonaland and Matabeleland, because these wars were fought differently. The whites had to fight with the Ndebele, then they had also to fight with the what? With the Shona. Right, that's why there's a historian called D.N. Beach who called them Zimurengas. He said that labeling it Chimurenga is false because it involved the whites fighting the Shona and the Ndebele one after the other. So instead of saying Chimurenga, he suggested the phrase Zimurenga. So the 1896 war was not a rebellion because the Shona and the Ndebele had accepted white rule as legitimate. So D.N. Beach argued that the suggestion of colonial historians which use the word rebellion is misleading because Africans had not accepted colonial rule as being legitimate. So he further argued that the word rebellion is obnoxious and unnecessary. Beach prefers to call these uprisings resistance. No. Yeah. Because they, like in Mamuga Kotora Nyika Eduga, then Tabla fighter back Nyika Edu Motoro Tirima rebels. So he's saying it's a war of resistance. The whites came into our country and took our country. Yes. And those why it a second Chimurenga. Kutima guerrillas. Like title on Vapiwa. Zino chance what no it labeling. Kana took sociology. Kuti teacher katodza mwana kuti uridofo. Zvinotopinda mfungwa dzake. Zvinotopinda mfungwa ende ini ndotozvaavoida. Ndinogona kuboyikana nestudent ndotaurira mumwoyo mangu. Dai zidofo rimunhu ane boas ngaiti. But haudzi munhu mashoko iwaya. Haudzi munhu mashoko iwaya. Unoratidza frustration, that's we call it emotional intelligence. Yes. Iwo safunga kuti vanhu vekuna naye kuniti vanenge vachifonera vanenge vasinawo hasha vanenge vaitadzo, but they always try to be professional because mumwe munhu anogona kufona achibvunza zvisina nebasa rese. Ndovanhu vanofona kuti anogona kufonera dzimwe nyaya dzisina nebasa rese. Ndatofona hey ndikunetsa negirlfriend ari kufona kuEconet customer care, you know. So munhu wekuEconet anobva ato havapindure rafu. But nechemumwoyo even watopedza abviko kana pabreak vanenge vachitoti vakomana zvatobvosakana nazvo so. Vanotokupa suggestion madii maona nhingi kana wafundisi kana chii. Kana kuti madii mawerengawo tine madaily quotes atosenda, subscribe to them mupote muchiwana shoko raMwari, you know, something like that, you know. So sometimes labeling, tinoiti labeling, it's very dangerous. Kutopa munhu label kuti iwo uri chii chakati zvinogona kukanganisa munhu izvo ende zvinogona kukanganisa picture futi. So some colonial historians called it a what? They called it a rebellion, which means they were now calling us rebels, but in no. So D.N. Beach, I don't know, it's called a war of resistance. We are resisting, we are defending our sovereignty. So historians like David Dinomeni Beach also argues that there were various Zimurengas rather than a Chimurenga. There were separate uprisings. The Ndebele and the Shona rose at different times. And in Matabeleland it began in March 1896 and in Mashonaland it started in June. So Rasmussen and Robert argued that the Ndebele and the Shona people and their allies waged essentially separate revolts, but rose for much the same reasons and at roughly the same time. So their grievances against the Bisak and settlers were just more or less the same. So paneva wanoti no, it's not Zimurengazi because zvinhu zvakakonzeresa hondo iyi kunyange tiri kuti tine Mashona neMandebele, they were the same things, you know, which include cattle seizures, forced recruitment, inept bullying police and administrators, abuse of women, and the likes. So what were the causes of the first Chimurenga? What were the causes of the first Chimurenga? So we are going to look at the Ndebele grievances. Zvigumbu zveMandebele, ma grievances zvigumbu. Then Shona grievances. So there's no monocausal theory, that can adequately explain the complex totality out of which the risings occurred. There is, however, little doubt that the economic grievances were at the center of the 1896 rising, and the political, social, and religious factors also played a complementary role. So what were the causes of the first Chimurenga and Matabeleland, Ndebele grievances? So we can categorize them into three: Papanema, economic, social, and what? And political. Right. Let me start with the most important, the economic ones. So there were economic reasons or economic causes or economic grievances. So loss of land by the Ndebele was the major cause of the war in Matabeleland. The Ndebele lost most of their rich arable and pasture lands to the whites, and after they were defeated in the Anglo-Ndebele War of 1893 and 1894, they were segregated or they were relegated to reserve areas. The whites even created those reserve areas. Very much foot maki people to make Garamagavariwa Murim fence. So they were going Shangani, where the Ndebele were forced to live. These reserves were dry, remote, and tsetse fly infested. So thus there was little production which took place in such an environment. So the Ndebele viewed them as cemeteries and not home. Pananunzi T or Ranger, Anotanzi, the area were like a cemetery. One cause of dissatisfaction and unrest explained, Chief, is that we have lived many years in a spot. We are told that the white men had purchased it and we have to let go. So the Ndebele even viewed them as cemeteries. Which means to an extent that they even called it the what? Yes. So they also lost their cattle. Yes. Loss of cattle was also a major grievance because it's all about disposition of the economic facets. So they lost their cattle, and it was one of the major grievances of the Ndebele. Soon after the defeat of the Ndebele in the 1893 war, the whites confiscated Ndebele cattle, notwithstanding the fact that cattle were the backbone of the Ndebele economy. They took both state and individual cattle. Because Papanese is incomo sesipala neno chindebele chanotaura mombe idzi kwakune mombe dzevanhu koita dzainzi mombe dzenyika. So havana kusegregata pakudzipamba mombe idzi vakatora dzese. And according to T.O. Ranger, before the 1893-1894, the Ndebele had 250,000 cattle. That's a lot. But after the war, they were left with only 40,930. So Ranger further argued that these cattle left were not equally distributed among the Ndebele, as the commission tended to favor the Indunas who were loyal to them. So even mombe dzacho dzadzasara vakatanga kudzishare kuma Indunas. Because pane mamwe ma Indunas futi anga akabribwa nema whites vakatanga kutotengesa base, vakatanga kutengesa musangano. So war was thus as imminent as the Ndebele resented loss of cattle, which was the backbone of their economy and the symbol of status. So there was also the formalizing or institutionalizing of forced labor. We call it Chibaro. It was another cause of this war in Matabeleland. The settlers who needed labor to work in mines and farms embarked on recruitment of forced laborers within the Ndebele state itself. So the creation of reserves was meant to create a constant supply of labor. The institutionalization of taxation in 1894 was also meant to force Africans to work for whites, as the taxes were paid in form of money. I think I once explained it. The whites had to introduce hordes of taxes. Deep tank tax, heart tax, dog tax, cattle tax. And those taxes were supposed to be paid by cash. Of which before the whites came, we were in a cashless economy. We could engage in barter trade. That's what we used to do. So my whites have no change their lifestyle. And so people are now compared to work in the farms and the mines, So there was also the use of shambok. According to D.N. Beach, the crux of the 1896 war was the labor issue and the use of hippopotamus whip. So Davidson argues that the shambok became the epitome of white men's administration. The standard punishment was 25 lashes. Hippopotamus whip, So T.O. Ranger argued that it was the custom of the whites to beat their employees towards pay days so that they forfeit their wages. So why was it when Vashanda towards Upera women the white and one? Then Munoramani Ash. So forced labor was either by chiefs or by police instructed to do so by the company's native department. So this implies that the chiefs were only the mouthpiece and not originators of these policies. It should be noted that the Native Commission recruited people to work, disregarding the Ndebele caste system. So zvekuti mundebele mune mazanzi maehla mehole mawaits akabhataiwa tisikuita izvozvo. So there was also the introduction of taxation, like I said. There were a lot of taxes, and taxi yacho yaitwa nobhadharwa nechi, and maiti mukaramba kubhadhara taxi maingotorewa mombe dzacho futi. Vaita chifinu big time, vaibva vatora mombe ndizvo zvese, everything, mombe nembudzi vakusiyai mune huku tu chete. So the social grievances included abuse of African women, caused in 1896 war in Matabeleland, and they could use that, they could kidnap women and children so that they could force their men to work. Or they could rape the women openly. So police says they were held hostages to force their husbands to report to work. So mwana waka 3 months aingotorwa nevarongonza aenda naye ari kuyamwa oendwa naye kuti arigei kuti uyo mushanda, you know. So both the married and unmarried women were raped by both the Bisak police and the settlers. Why? Because they were the law unto themselves. So this forced the Ndebele to rise and stop the evil practice. And there was also the religious contradiction, like the Ndebele, just like the Shona, followed the African traditional religion, which is our normal and foundational religion, you know. So my whites ndopanga kutanga kuintroduce Christianity, because they now had the political foundation to do so, you know. So they began to attack our African religion, you know. So like Africans were using their religion to interpret their problem. This was, however, a bitter pill to swallow for the Ndebele, who respected and valued their culture. Hence, war was inevitable, because you cannot separate religion and culture. Ndosaka chinoti kuno vanhu vaindogara nchipa example kuti kuno vanhu vaya vamwe vanogara akasunga katukuke white even asiri kuchechi. That's their religion interfering. Ndosaka uri kuona kuti kune mazvikoro zvemachechi. The reason why vachidaro kuti vaise mavalue echechi pamastudents anenge achidzidza, kuti pave ne like social and socialization, the upbringing yacho iri very religious. So natural disasters made the war inevitable. A series of drought occurred in 1895 to 1896, and the natural disasters they were now attributed to the presence of the whites. Kuti ma whites aya kuvapo kwao ndo kuri kukonzeresa kuti mvura dzisanaye. So towards the end of this season, the area was also hit by a severe cattle disease, rinderpest, which is a highly contagious disease. So to prevent the spread of the disease to white farms, company administrators even killed the Ndebele cattle, because the rinderpest diseases were like they were contagious. And some of the cattle were even banned. So worse still, the people were not allowed to eat the meat of the cattle short as the cattle were banned. The killing and burning of cattle was seen as a deliberate move by the whites to starve them. And there was also an outbreak of locusts which devoured their crops. The religious leaders like Mulugulu, Mkwati, and Singi Nyamache interpreted these misfortunes as being caused by white persons who failed to placate and respect the whites. Hence, war was what became unavoidable. The war became inevitable, you know. Because vaifana kutobvisa mawaitsi vaibhozi vainterpreta vemidzimu nechi vaiti chiri kusaka kuti mvura inaye muone moto. It is because of what? The presence of the whites. So political grievances. The Ndebele were denied from choosing a new king after the death of Lobengula. And according to T.O. Ranger in Matabeleland, in an attempt to transform the whole structure of the Ndebele society, the monarchy was abolished. Lobengula was dead. Not only his sons were sent to South Africa to be educated at Rhodes, you know, like my sons, I advise your system, my sons, that's an hereditary system, so vakaita get rid of vana vacho kuti vaite make sure kuti pasare pasina kana leadership inokwanisa kuzomukira the whites. So the regimental towns were broken up and none of the Ndebele indunas were recognized as authorities for the purpose of administration, and the members of the Zanzi caste were compelled to work side by side with the Gole, and hence war was inevitable as the Ndebele wanted to resuscitate their monarch. Then loss of independence by the Ndebele after the 1896 war caused the Ndebele uprising, And according to D. Chanaiwa, resentment against alien rule and angered a growing attitude of resistance towards the white. Proud chiefs and indunas found themselves treated with arrogant contempt. They lost independence because ivo vacho whites vanga vasinga respect much authority yemashona. They didn't want to respect the authority of the what of the Shona of the Ndebele, sorry, to an extent yekuti vamwe vanhu vaitorespektwawo munharaunda vakatanga kutoonekwa sevanhu vasina basa. So there was lawlessness. The traditional leaders lost their respect they used to enjoy in society, and British laws took precedence over Ndebele laws. Hence war was inevitable as the Ndebele disliked their subservient position. And I think I once explained about the settler brutality, right? How they ill-treated the whites in the farms and the mines. It's also a cause. There was the use of corporal punishment, and the Ndebele resented the abuse of authority. Hence the Ndebele had no choice except to take up arms against the whites. So there was also the Jameson raid fiasco. Failure was the immediate cause of the war in Matabeleland. Matangira akaita hondo pakaitika inonzi Jameson raid. Like Jameson akabva nemamwe mapurisa nemamwe masoja achienda kuSouth Africa. Then Mandebele party chance given. Remember, most of these whites lived in isolated farms. Whites mazhinji agara maprazi ekuti panapa panenge pane prazi, the next prazi toriwana ku Epworth, the next prazi toriwana ku Waterfalls, the next prazi tori like saka waingosvikirwa uri ikoko hakuna kwekuchenera. Kwasiyana nekuti panapa mukandibata huro ndikangoti yowe vanhu vese vanobuda panze kusango, pakati pesango. Remember, these are new settlements, so waingosvikirwa ikoko. Zvekutoti Chimurenga matangira chakaita whites aigona kutodefeatwa vakatozotakwara panu later. Otherwise pakatofa whites over 100 first days. Bozi vaingomimba kumasango ikoko one by one. Bozi munhu akachigara pakati peprazi ari one. Anoziva dzimba dzevarungu vaida zvekugara mumazidheni aya maziprazi. You know, that was the case. So they took advantage of the what? There wasn't enough police in Zimbabwe. So the warriors began to attack white farms and traders in Matabeleland, marking the beginning of the what? Of the first Chimurenga. Right. So let us move on to Mashonaland. What were the grievances of the Shona? They also lost land, and soon after the occupation of Zimbabwe in 1890, white mercenaries were rewarded with large tracts of land as earlier promised, and the settlers went about claiming and pegging land that previously belonged to traditional chiefs. And Chief Mashayamumbi and these people, for example, were punished by a white farmer for trespassing on his farm. Like vakangofambawo mufarm, then they were punished. So they lost all the land and reached pastures, and it became a common and very serious grievance of the Shona. Nyaya land. Even ukada tikazobata sire Chimurenga uchanoona kuti yangeri nyaya yeland futi. However, it should be noted that the land issue should not be exaggerated on the other hand, because it was not until 1908 when the whites had failed to obtain enough gold they wanted that they turned to land of farming. So according to DN Beach, many people, especially in Mashonaland, still possessed their land, and that's true. And men who had not lost land joined the struggle, and men who had lost land did not join the war. So D.N. Beach argues that the war ended in late 1897, not so much because of the fighting, but because it was vital for the people to start the 1897 to 1898 summer cropping. So this was an indication that many people were still in possession of land. Hence the land issue becomes important if it is connected with other what? With other factors. Kumashona vanga land, of course, it was a cause. Vakatoriwa but not hysteric. Because anti Mashona Chimurenga chitanga vanhu vakatanga kuengaja muChimurenga Mandebele. Mashona akatozojoina later muna June, and the main reason why vakanonoka kujoina it is because anti vanga vachi harvester. It means they had the land. That's the point that is trying to be put across here. But we shouldn't leave the fact that they also lost their cattle to the whites. That's another cause. So the seizures of cattle from both the Ndebele and the Shona It was one of the major features of the Bisa rule. The Shona largely lost their cattle to the whites through taxation, since they used the cattle to pay tax so as to avoid selling their labor in mines and farms with harsh working conditions. So according to P. Mason, the question of cattle was a matter for which many Bantu people lay very near to care of self-respect, without which men or a people break into degradation or desperate violence. So there was also the introduction of forced labor, just like in the Ndebele state. The Shona, just like the Ndebele, were forced to work in settler farms and mines, and workers would work for the white months for the whole month and be given a blanket. That's what they used to do. Shanda boots. You know. So workers were also subjected to heavy punishments for simple offenses, and the Beach argued that the crux of the 1896 rising was the labor issue and the use of the hippopotamus whip. So Ranger argued that it was the custom of the whites to beat their employees towards payday so that they forfeit their wages. And Minister Chombo. But yeah, minister ainzi mundaranga ine nharo so. Ainzi Zobo ndiye akamboti parliament akati chi do I want to say correctly? Ainzi half of the people who are in this parliament are donkeys, like in parliament, man. Then speaker, but please, why don't you withdraw your statement? Whatever half of say. So half of the people in this parliament are not donkeys. Yeah. Statement, Raj. Could utter half your one, they are not donkeys. But half of the people are not donkeys, which means on the other end, you may half of it. So panaka video pakaitika independence in 1980, we had a deal called the reconciliation. Hatina kubva taita get rid of the whites ipapapo. Pakazvetwa na land reform program, I think muna early 2000 inchi, but the government initially worked with the whites. But no whites acho anga asingashandiki nawo futi. Vaita utsinye nechi. So iye akauya on a fact finding mission on that farm. Bozi anenge akanzwa report yekuti murungu uyu ari kudini zvaaita murungu uyu anenge aita hire and fire zviya zvekuti akahaya vanhu kuti vagrade tobacco kana vaite sei vapedza kushanda obva avabuditsa waita sei papa nemudhara aitotaura achitoti akandibata huru achindirumisa nembuka kutsoka nechi, like that's what they used to do. Ndo atiti settler brutality. So sometimes unozopesera warama nehasha because munhu kana aine my emotions haafungi zviri straight. Ndosaka chinoti murume nemukadzi vakanetsana, murume akatanga kutuka kuti ndosaka mai wako ari muroyi vari kudini, obva arohwa unosungisa murume, da kusungisa ida kujeri ikoko mangwana unomona muendesera sadza. So chachiri kushanda nezuro hadzisi brain dzake but their emotions. Anozoti agara because brain dzinozoti bengeni kuti wakomana ndanichanzwa ngasadani, hey murume wangu, hey saenda kutondirambwa kaini, ototanga oendesa sadza akutotanga kutokumbira polisi, ndokumbiro vavatadi vada kuti vabudo because ndo vanotoshanda kumbawo ndokuti mapurisa kuti hamutikwanire matovhurisa docket, you know. So tokuedzotsanangura the emotions, you know, because mulife futi kwava munhu anokurumidza utsamwa anoita ma emotions unonyura, unofanira kuva inonzi emotional intelligence. Ini pano pangu pacho pekuti ndinotoona kuti munhu ari kuti disrespect auchi anongada kundishora auchi, but ndinototambira mari. Sometimes ndinototambira mari yacho because ndiri kuziva kuti ndiri kuzowana mari at the end of the day ndorarama. Then pano ma instances unoona kuti ndinoitawo emotional. Munhu abva anga agare nemari yake. Pano musikana akamboti handisi tokutrasta iwo, saka ndozokupai tanga inonditisa ma lessons, ndozokubhadhara imari later on. And that man was 20 years. Of which 20 years ndo mari on average andoisa few mota mangu. Then vanongoti kana iwo handisi kutrasta futi ko ukasanipo mari yacho zvazvangopera zvakadaro. But kana uri munhu uya anenge ane patience asina pride sometimes unogona kuti aregai ndishande ozotipa mari. And on the same time futi ukaratidza futi desperation munhu anobva akudzikisira. So unofanira kutoratidzawo kuti you're on top of the game. Because iwe uri kutengesa something chiri kunzi 3000 US woti ane 2.5 uyai, so watoredusa munhu uya ane 2.5 anobva atoshamaya pane 2000 keshi ipapa. And when you keep on selling, ukatoseta that precedence, vamwe vese vakuya vanongonzi aiwa uyu ukataura naine mari yakati. So unofanira kunge uri munhu yakaoma musoro ane mastandards ari high, you know. So there was also the introduction of taxation by the whites, who also forced the Shona to take up whites' arms against them. The taxes included hard tax, dog tax, deep tax, and poor tax. And the ranger argued that the final straw came with the demand of payment of hard tax. Because you know, imagine kubhadhariswa impamba pako paunogara ende kumusha hakuna kanzuru kai kuti umwe muchibhadhara rendi nemvura nechichi wanziwo makubhadhara tax kumusha. So a number of chiefs who resisted payment of taxes instructed their own people to drive away or kill tax collectors. Mamwe machiefs futi aitoudza vanhu kuti hai musajairiwe rovai vanhu stiri. So a case in point is one which occurred in 1894 in Lomagundi, where 2 tax collectors were killed. Kunzi Nyandoro chief even used the firearms acquired from Portuguese traders to resist tax collectors. So it should be noted that taxation was an indirect way of recruiting labor, because the taxes were paid in form of what? Of tax, of cash. And collect of tax kwacho papa ni settler brutality. Vaisvika vopisa misha urowa machief. Imagine the chief urowa vanhu vakatarisa zvainyadzisa. So in simple terms, it means the Africans had lost their what? Their independence, right? Yes. So for you to regain your independence, you have to fight for it. They even lost their trade with the Portuguese. The Shona used to trade with what? With the Portuguese, and it caused the war in Mashonaland. So the coming of the Bismarck led to the banning of Shona lucrative trade with the Portuguese. Guns, beads, clothes, and many goods were acquired from the Portuguese. The goods coming from South Africa through Bismarck were more expensive than those they acquired from the Portuguese. You know, my goods are in Bismarck idura. So when I trade nema Portuguese, then my Pozaka So my social causes are not like abuse of women and children made the Shona to rise against the whites in 1896. Shona women were raped by the Bismarck police and British settlers. And the issue of religion again. Ava vakuda kutonyatsa kutoforsa kuti namata aitai zvana mai Maria kuita kudzipa vanhu pauro tichiko siyai midzimu yenyu yamuri kuitai. So vanhu vakati aiwa isusu religion yedu is also part and parcel of our freedom. So ndo paizoitika nyaya dzemanatural disasters which caused the war. So there was a winter pest and also a plague of locusts. So to prevent the spread of winter pest, the European areas, the Europeans killed or affected cattle and burned them. And kwacho kwakusori kuuraya kwekuti dzasichaspreada kungori kuuraya kwekukaurisa kake ndizvo. So nehanda and Kabui gave these disasters a religious interpretation. Then there were also political causes. Loss of independence by the Shona forced them to take up arms against the whites. This loss of independence was indicated by the payment of taxes to the whites in their own country. You know, so that was loss of independence, and the loss of self-determination forced many Shona into the Chimurenga. Kuti vanga vasina like nationalism or kuzvitonga vega. So D. Chanayo argued that resentment against alien rule endangered the growing attitude of resistance towards whites. And the papatonism area kuti nenyaya yekushungurudzwa kwavaramba vachiita, because munhu kana uchimushungurudza anongosvika panonzi breaking point okuudza kuti usiri kufande kupi. So that's what also compelled people to fight, you know. Right. So there was brutal administration in Mashonaland, which caused the 1896 war. Individual settlers tended to make their own forms of justice in their locals. Like pane dzimwe nyaya dzekuti dzaifanira kutongwa nemasabhuku dzisolvwa dzadzakutwa nevarungu, and they could decide kuti vojaja sei. So pamwe pacho judgment yange iri kusungirira munhu pamuti mumurova nezichambuko kumusana kusvikira asuka kumusana. So they even challenged African chiefs. The police were so brutal, especially so they often flogged the chiefs in the presence of their subjects. So because of that, Papa Sinanyaya war was supposed to happen. So next lesson, which is from Monday, we are going to look into the cause of Chimurenga in Matabeleland. The cause of the Chimurenga in Matabeleland and the cause in Mashonaland too. In fact, we are going to round up the Chimurenga. Right.